Okay, I think it's looking good on my side. Buddha, if you have everything in order on the LinkedIn side, we're ready to go. Take it away.
Yeah, that all looks good. All right. Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome everyone to the season premiere of the OpenAPI Hangouts. This is going to be a series of webinars that we'll be hosting, talking all things OpenAPIs. I am going to be your host for today, Buddha, developer advocate at Tyke, as well as the board chair of the OpenAPI initiative. And joining me today are three absolutely star-studded panelists who will have discussions amongst ourselves. We're going to be exploring a very, very exciting new topic, which, if you have been following along with the OpenAPI initiative, is all about introducing the Arazzo specification. Now, what it is, what it's all about, what you can expect out of it, what are the values around it, and some of the use cases and roadmaps around it. That's what makes up today's session. But this is going to be an open discussion. So bring in your questions, comment, engage with us. We are here to talk to you, engage with you, and understand what you need and what you want to learn, not just today, but also in the future. With that, let's go straight into the introductions. As I said, I am Buddha, developer advocate at Tyke and the board chair of the OpenAPI initiative. Over to you, perhaps, Frank, a little bit about who you are.
Thank you, Buddha. Yeah, I am Frank Kilcommons. I am Principal API Evangelist at SmartBear, also a board member at the OpenAPI Initiative, and have had the pleasure on working with the Arazzo specification over the last year or so and getting it live together with many other people in the community. And yeah, we're very excited to talk about it today.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank. Over to you, Lorna.
Hi everyone, I'm Lorna. My day job is VP Developer Experience at Redockley. I'm also involved in the OpenAPI initiative predominantly as a member of the technical steering committee for the main OpenAPI specification. But I would describe myself as an API specification omnivore. I enjoy all of the ones, both under the OpenAPI umbrella and the wider landscape. So yeah, just really excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Lorna. And last but not least, over to you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. So, hi everybody. I'm Erik Wilde. I'm like Lorna. I like that. I would also say I'm an API omnivore. So I've been working in the API space for quite a while. I work as a principal consultant for InnoQ, also an OAI board member, and I also help OAI as a ambassador, meaning that I've organized quite a number of events at different conferences, and over the last year, we've seen a lot of interest in Arazzo whenever we were talking about that new upcoming specification, which is the reason why we have that in our season premiere. So I'm really happy to talk about that.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric. That's a great round of introductions. Once again, we are currently live on LinkedIn as well as YouTube. So again, wherever you're joining us from, feel free to bring in your questions and comments. We are monitoring both those channels. So, at any point of time, if you do have questions, do let us know. We will do our best. This is the first time we are also trying out these different platforms and channels. So it's a bit of a learning experience for us, but hopefully, again, we are here to help you understand a little bit more about the OpenAPI initiative itself, as well as Arazzo, and hopefully a little bit about what you would need in the future. So quick agenda. I think we've already completed our introduction and a welcome to the Hangout itself. Then we're going to be going into a little bit of an overview of the OpenAPI initiative. Some of you might already know us. Some of you may be quite unfamiliar with it. But either way, we believe you should know who or what OpenAPI initiative is. And we'll cover a little bit more about that. Then what is Arazzo and not Arazzo and why it matters. We go into then a panel discussion about some of the questions, some of the key areas around Arazzo. We'll go into a Q&A after that, which is where, again, we pick up your questions. And then finally, what else you can expect in future sessions. Moving right along, I think we don't want to spend too much time on the slides, but just to give you a bit of that introduction into what we are going to be talking about and who we are. The OpenAPI initiative was created by a consortium of industry experts to standardize how APIs are described. The focus here was to create, evolve, and promote a vendor-neutral API description format. Now we are no longer just a single specification organization. We are actually a multi-spec organization, thanks to Arazzo coming into the fore. Some of the key highlights, one that you're probably more familiar than the others, which is the OpenAPI specification. currently at the 3.1 version, if I'm not wrong. And then Arazzo is recently launched. Some of you might be familiar with overlays as well, and the work on that is again restarted, which Lorna over here is leading and driving to a point as well. So once again, if some of these areas excite you, interest you, you're familiar with, or want to know a little bit more about, always free to join us on our open Slack channel and join the community, join the discussions. There are already 1,200 plus members on Slack. We would love to add to those numbers. There are 35 plus member organizations right now across different industries who are, again, contributing actively to the specifications themselves, as well as to the growth of the community and the organization. We are officially part of the Linux Foundation, which again makes sure that we are well supported in our endeavors as we go along. This is sort of a bit of a landscape about some of the current members out there. Some might be familiar to you. If you would like yourself to be a part of this, well, reach out to us and we'll talk about how you can do so. The OpenAPI Hangouts, as I said, this is the season premiere. This is the first time we are trying something like this out. And again, the objective of doing something like this was to be able to connect with the community a little bit better, to let everyone know what's really going on, and use it as a feedback mechanism as well in terms of what do you need and how do we support you as the community members to drive adoption, drive education, and get the best possible value out of the work that is being done by the amazing team within the OpenAPI initiative. So this is going to be an open forum to discuss all things open APIs. It could be technical specification related, it could be business value related, case studies, communities, behind the scenes as well, to a point. And we're endeavoring to actually host these on a monthly basis. And the topics will vary. The faces here are likely to vary as well. If you want to be a part of this, you can be as well. This is a community-led initiative. So these are not just the only 4 people who will ever be part of this. So we would love your participation. So with that, I'm going to hand the stage over to Frank, who is going to be introducing us to the world of the Arazzo specification, all about workflows. Over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Buddha. So Arazzo is the name of our new specification, of course, and it literally is a direct translation of tapestry into Italian, which we think depicts the essence of the specification very well, which is all about weaving different interactions with APIs together to get to a meaningful outcome. And bringing us into that, why did we create this specification? It really is looking at the broader API landscape that's out there and the challenges that we have all faced in our careers, both on the provider side of APIs and on the consumer side of APIs. Having documentation for your APIs is, of course, a fundamental step, and there are technical specifications out there like OpenAPI, of course, which we're all advocates of here, as well as sister specifications like Async API. And these really are kind of the raw technical ingredients for describing the surface area of an API. But when it comes to consuming an API, more often than not, we need to do more than just a single call to help us achieve our jobs to be done as a consumer. And up until quite recently, from the specifications and standards communities, we haven't really had a mechanism to allow us to be able to describe that type of use case, or having kind of business value orientated use cases described in a way that is sufficiently human readable and machine readable when it comes to modern API technologies that we're using. There's older technologies out there, of course, that are kind of very heavy in the orchestration and workflow capabilities, but nothing so much when it comes to interacting with APIs that are described with some of the newer technical specifications. And that was a lot of the why we started the special interest group around focusing on workflows and reaching this specification. Maybe you could just go back one slide there, Buddha, please. So when we talk about the Arazzo specification, what is it? Well, it really is, it gives us an approach to document use case oriented workflows in a programmatical readable format. So the formats that we're familiar with when it comes to OpenAPI are also applicable here. So we're dealing with things like YAML, things like JSON. And when I talk about a workflow, really a workflow is just a series of API calls, which when woven together help us to accomplish a relevant outcome or objective. And we really see this kind of helping the ability for providers to have control over the use cases that they're exposing towards their consumers, but also giving us the ability through the tooling that we'll be stood up around the specification, and we'll talk a little bit about that later today. But that will really improve the consumer experience for all of the teams that will be interacting with APIs, either APIs built by their own companies or third-party APIs that they're integrating into their own systems. Now, the dominant use cases that we focused on from kind of a working group when we were working towards the specification, so you can advance the slide, but thank you, was really the ability to be able to provide deterministic recipes for the use of APIs. So I think we've all been in the situation where we are consuming an API and we're onboarding into whatever platform that API is being exposed to us via, and we get handed this very, very long technical reference documentation. And that's great, of course, but it doesn't necessarily explain to us intrinsically how we need to achieve a particular objective. So we wanted to give an ability to provider teams to be able to focus on providing those deterministic use cases. It's also very common that we will have a more modular approach to delivering APIs, and therefore the different API, let's say, endpoints will be described across multiple OpenAPI files. But again, we don't have any built-in mechanism through specifications to help us describe how we can chain and weave those particular API calls together. Outside of that, we also wanted to have living documentation. So one of the big pains that's in the industry, again, when we think about onboarding developers to our APIs, is that we will provide them access to the technical reference documentation, but we will also provide them access to more static human centric documentation. So be that HTML that we're embedding into a developer portal, be that PDF documents, different flow diagrams, maybe Word docs, Google Slides, pictures, scribbles that we're taking pictures of and sending over Slack. But as soon as we put the effort into creating those mediums of documentation, they have this unfortunate kind of aspect of going stale very, very quickly. So we wanted to have an ability to have a more living documentation approach that we can really ensure that the API and series of API calls is still actually doing what we're proclaiming it will do on the 10. And that brings us into that assertable business value. So if we have a complex system that is spanning multiple APIs and we're proclaiming or promising to consumers that if you call the APIs in this particular order, you will achieve what you need to achieve. Well, we need to make sure that if any change happens to any of those underlying APIs, that we can still ensure that that overarching use case is still achievable. So the assertability and the machine readable attributes of Arazzo make that very, very possible. One of the other kind of dominant use cases, and we'll go into kind of more kind of real world samples of this as we progress in today's panel discussion. But one other area that was very dominant in our thinking was to reinvigorate the whole tooling ecosystem around code gen and SDK generation, specifically having use case orientated SDKs and generated code, rather than just generating code off this big unwieldy OpenAPI description, which will then give you boilerplate code for the full surface area of the API. So again, if you can keep the consuming developer on-piste, focused on the use case that they're interested in, not being distracted by the bloat or the verbosity of all of the generated code. We've been working with other industry standards groups as well around looking at improving regulatory checks and benchmarking abilities. So take open banking as an example. So all of these banks within, let's focus on Open Banking UK as an example. So the 9 major banks, as well as many, many more, are being regulatory mandated to expose APIs. But can we ensure that the APIs that they're exposing are achieving the use cases in a consistent manner? And that's something that's very, very interesting. Within the security domain, we're looking together with the OpenID Connect folks around being able to describe more complex security negotiations through the Arazzo specification. So thinking about various OAuth flows and financial or FAPI grade APIs, things like push authorization requests, etc. These things are quite difficult to be able to describe purely using the OpenAPI specification, and because they're spanning different endpoints across different providers potentially. So again, this is another use case that we're focusing on from an Arazzo perspective. And then the elephant in the room, which was coming up quite a lot as we were working on this specification within the working group, was, well, is this going to have any impact on the whole wave of AI developments that are happening in the space? And absolutely, we think so. So the deterministic aspect of Arazzo is something that's very, very crucial. And when we are handing off responsibility to AI agents to perform complex or sensitive API consumption on our behalf, well, we need to make sure that it will work first time right and every time right. And there is no room for hallucination. So we need something that will be able to direct those agents in the correct way to be able to chain together the sequence of calls and do the right operations on our behalf. It also will hopefully negate some anti-patterns that we're seeing pop up. So where we are having a slew of, let's say, vendor-specific semantics bleeding into API designs in order to allow APIs to kind of help provide context for AI models. It's something that I personally am referring to as backend for LLM. If we're doing or leveraging something like Arazzo, it means we can describe these things in a tooling agnostic, vendor agnostic manner, and that in the end will have better interoperability for the practitioners who are crafting APIs and bringing APIs to market. So they're the dominant use cases. There's a whole slew of other ones, and we may touch on those as we progress. In the next slide, I'll just give you a very, very high-level overview of the Arazzo specification itself. So if you're familiar with OpenAPI, this type of picture should seem fairly familiar to you. And indeed, there are some similarities between Arazzo and OpenAPI. You know, we didn't completely reinvent the wheel. We tried to build on top of the great work that has happened already within the OpenAPI initiative. So the Arazzo specification itself has a similar structure in various aspects. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll describe very, very briefly some of the main objects that are part of the specification. So first off, we have the info object, and that's just very, very simple metadata about the defined Arazzo document itself. So very similar to the info object that's part of OpenAPI. We then have source descriptions. So this is where we kind of set the scope for where the various workflows that are described in an Arazzo document can be described over. So you can think of them a little bit like imports or a little bit like namespaces. So for example, if we wanted to describe a workflow across 3 OpenAPI documents, we would pull in and reference those APIs as part of the source descriptions. And that will make sure that we have an ability to validate that the workflow we are actually describing is achievable based on the APIs that are being referenced. We then have the workflows themselves, and these describe the workflows to be taken across one or more of the API endpoints that are accessible based on the source descriptions that we've pulled in. Workflows, just like any other piece of software, may require certain inputs to get going. So we have an inputs object, and this can be described using JSON schema. And again, this is just out-of-band inputs that need to be passed into the workflow. So in a very crude example, you could imagine if the workflow needed to authenticate for some endpoint, you could pass in some credentials that are stored out of band and passed securely into the workflow. We then have the steps. So the steps themselves represent a call to an API operation or indeed another workflow. Each step can have a list of parameter objects. You may have noticed that parameters are also at the workflow level. And basically all that means is if a parameter is described at the workflow level, it's applicable for all of the steps that are defined within that workflow. Outside of that type of situation, you will explicitly describe the parameters within a step. You then have things like success criteria, and this will be the various criterion that will determine if a step is successful or not successful. And based on the answer to that question, you have a mechanism to deal with things that are on the happy path or on the non-happy path. So you have success actions, which are optional things that you can do upon success of an API call. You then have failure actions. So a very common example might be we get a 401 back from a particular API endpoint. We inspect the token. We determine that the auth token that we provided is no longer valid. We would then reach out to another workflow potentially to refresh that token, and then we can continue on executing or re-executing the current step and then executing the rest of the workflow. Every step can then return outputs or make outputs available for the next or subsequent steps within the workflow itself. So we do that via the outputs object, which is just a simple map between a friendly name and a dynamic output value. And then similarly, the workflow itself has the concept of outputs, which we can then return to the calling context. So back to the software that's actually invoking the workflow itself. And in the next slide, I'll briefly talk about all of the reusable components. So we have, very similar to OpenAPI, we have the concept of components where you can describe reusable objects that will be reused throughout different parts of the Arazzo document. And we have a series of these also within Arazzo, which will basically aid us to keep the verbosity of Arazzo documents as minimal as possible and promote reuse within them. So that's a whirlwind tour through the structure of the Arazzo specification. So nothing scary there. And we will share some links to more in-depth material where we go into more detail on all of the objects themselves. So back to you, Buddha. You're on mute.
There we go. All right.
I win getting to say that first.
It had to be once, at least. It had to be once.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot, Frank, for that. That's a great introduction into Arazzo. I think we are starting to get a few questions. I think we'll pick some of those up as we go along. But that's a really great introduction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen because Brave is working a little bit weirdly. And I think we can go into some of the questions, some of the discussion points, and get some of the other panelists into the conversation as well. And I think you sort of touched upon this a little bit already, Frank, about the value of Arazzo. But I think going over to, say, Lorna for a start, perhaps, could you perhaps add your own experience on the value of Arazzo and how you would describe that to someone who's either looking to adopt it or sort of thinking about using it within their organization right now?
Yeah, I think I am echoing Frank in lots of ways, but for me, the real value is that it does build on OpenAPI, which is a familiar and tested technology. It's something that we all have in our workflows, probably a bunch of you all watching do as well. So there's that solid existing technology basis with great tool support. What Arazzo brings is the ability to describe how those things play together. So it's a sequence or a flow of API calls. Some APIs are super simple. You need to call this endpoint to do that thing, but a lot of them are not really. And so Arazzo captures that and lets us explain how those complexities go together, and also to be sensitive to what happens earlier in the process. So if there's a chain of 3 or 4 calls and the third one doesn't respond with what we're expecting, tooling can realize, oh, we should do something different here. And Frank already mentioned that success criteria. And I think that's a really important strength of this, that it gives us the value in terms of bringing insight. And of course, it's an open standard, which is something that means it's safe for all of us to build for and adopt, and we can be part of that community that builds and evolves that. And that's a real big value too.
Great. Thanks, Lorna. Eric, over to you. Anything to add to that? Maybe any of the use cases that maybe Frank mentioned that sort of stand out to you, or how you think something like this could resonate well with people who are already invested in OpenAPI specification, perhaps?
I mean, one of the things that I still remember is because we have been talking, I don't even know, Frank, when we had the first presentation on Arazzo. I think it was like about a year ago, right? I think when we talked about that activity at I think in London, API Days London was the first presentation. And it was just amazing to me how many people just came up and said, oh yeah, that's great, right? We give it to us. Like, when is it ready? And I think that was really indicative of so many different things you can do with it. It's definitely, in terms of specifications, I think it's the one specification that has kind of the least amount of having to explaining having to explain it to anybody. Like everybody will say something, oh yeah, I can use it for this, I can use it for this, I can use it for that. And people have different ideas, and they have different use cases in mind. But I think pretty much everybody who has ever worked with APIs does understand that something like Arazzo will provide some value. And so from my experience, what I see is also that it really nicely complements what we've been trying to do in the API space. So for the last couple of years, we've tried to drive home the point that, of course, APIs are something technical, and it makes sense to have purely technical APIs, but you also should look at them as something that has actually business value, and you should work hard to create business level APIs, right? So that shift, I think, in mindset from purely technical APIs to APIs that expose business concepts is something that we've worked hard to establish. And I think more and more people are getting it and doing it. And I think Arazzo now kind of makes it easy for us to go one step even higher and say, oh, now that I have business level APIs, I can combine them to create even more abstract or more valuable things in the business space. And so for that reason, I think Arazzo really comes at a great moment in time, and I'm really optimistic in terms of seeing how the API community will react, how we will see uptake from vendors and tooling creators, and how this will change the way how people can use APIs.
Great. I
Yeah, I
mean,
think
you
that's
make
the
a very,
right
very
level
sorry,
of
go on.
abstraction. Even when it comes to how we think about how we describe the requirements for which we want to build software to meet, we generally think about them in terms of, what are the jobs to be done that we are trying to solve? What's the problem we're trying to solve for here? And you think about those generally in terms of use cases, and what are the functional things that we want to be able to deliver, rather than the conversation immediately going down into a technical task. And so I think we can kind of work our way down then through the levels of abstraction with the right assertability, to make sure that we can hopefully make the complexity as opaque as possible to the consumers, but still giving the providers a mechanism to have the tooling ecosystem support them from a quality perspective.
So after 5 years of trying to explain to people, do API first, now we have to say, no, do workflow first, and then do APIs.
I would almost position it a little bit differently. I think, Eric, you made that point around business value. I think there is still that mindset shift that is still, I would say, a work in progress for a lot of people, where they are still thinking sometimes solution first, sometimes tooling first. I think starting with that business problem and then figuring out the right way to approach it. I feel like Arazzo sort of adds to that existing tool stack and the way you would handle some of the business cases and business problems that you're facing. But again, it needs to start there. It needs to start with, what are you really trying to solve? And where does Arazzo fit into that narrative? And then once you've done that, then go into the actual solutioning of how those APIs are going to be driving value there. So that's a really valid point. I think another good area to sort of explore outside of the use cases is if you've seen folks who are already adopting Arazzo. I know, Lorna, you've recently written an article about how Redocly is doing that, so perhaps you can speak to that. Frank, you've got similar cases with some of the others who are already looking to adopt it in different levels and different ways. That'll be really good to know. So I'll come to you, Lorna, first, and then I'll head over to you, Frank.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know Redocly, we're a tools vendor. So you would think that we'd be adopting it like to provide services to other people, but in fact, our adoption was led by our internal needs. That the Arazzo specification is pretty close to the way that we were describing our API testing workflows. So we have a tool that does all this testing, and we just adapted our actually pretty close standard test descriptions to match the Arazzo standards. And in the process of that, well, we make a linter, and we wanted to make sure our own stuff was beautiful. And so the tool that's available immediately for everyone else to use is the Arazzo linting, so you can validate your specs. This makes working with the new format a lot easier, and I'm very happy to have it. Because I see the others nodding, like when you are doing that early adoption on a standard, it's like, does my tool not work? did I make a mistake in one of the input specifications? Is my description valid? Like, we have to start somewhere. So starting with the linter, but for us, it was all, the reason we're doing that is because we're using the format internally and it solves a problem that we had already identified. And I think a lot of other organizations will tell a similar story.
So one interesting question that's come up, there are a few questions coming up, by the way, on LinkedIn. So I'm going to see if I can incorporate some of those in our discussion already. David, hello, David, asks in the chat about, is there a certification process for tools or sample or test Arazzo workflow that exercises all features of the Arazzo spec that tools must support? So is there any sort of compliance, certification, any way to sort of test some of those things out already?
No, there isn't. And from our experiences with the OpenAPI specification, which solves a different problem but is much more established, I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be. The different tools are often used at different points in the pipeline. They all use different aspects of the description. So, for example, in your OpenAPI description, you might have a very rich set of metadata that's used purely for documentation, and your code gen tool doesn't use that. I'd expect to see something similar. So I'm not sure that we would quite see what David is asking there. But I think, if the spec at the moment is reasonably simple, there are some really good examples already in the repository as part of that initial piece of work. So we're pretty well set up for you to be able to evaluate your own stuff, and the community is always there to talk to and to help.
I think a lot of time the question tends to be around.
Itself sets out, let's say, the minimal aspects that you need to document to have what you would regard as a valid Arazzo document. Linters, of course, will really help and will bring that to the fore and make it easier for actually humans to craft these things and validate if they are indeed correct. Actual certification, it's this ongoing topic within the OAI in general that we haven't quite fundamentally solved yet. But I think linters will make it very, very easy. I know we're going to talk about the roadmap later as well, but one of the short-term things that we'll be working on is getting an actual JSON schema also published to determine or to, let's say, ease an ability for folks to validate is what they're crafting actually correct.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point about the way you adopt a specification like this. It's not necessarily a binary approach in the way you do that. It's not necessarily trying to adopt everything or nothing. You would have those different elements that make up the basic minimum requirements of the spec for its adoption, and then you can build on top of that as well quite easily. Kind of like, again, what you did with OpenAPI specification. There were elements that were critical. The others were things that you could build upon on an ongoing basis as well, which was a very interesting way to approach it. Frank, were there any other companies or organizations that you can speak of as well who are looking at adopting this in different ways or similar ways to what Lorna mentioned?
There are quite a few that are actively working on it. So at least close to 10 vendors, but I will not name names for anything that's not launched. Sure. What I will say is, as well as Redocly getting some tools live, which is excellent. LibLab have gone down the road of the SDK generation, so they have an ability to take an Arazzo document and from there generate SDKs to allow that workflow to work, which is great. We're working on stuff within SmartBear as well, but nothing live yet. So we will hold that announcement for now.
Maybe for the next Hangout. Question, Eric, were there any questions coming through on, any questions that we want to pick up from YouTube at all? Otherwise, I've got a couple from LinkedIn that I can obviously direct to the audience, to the panelists.
Yeah, go forward with those. I think that's a good idea.
Okay. So Karthik in the audience asks, how is the Arazzo specification similar to the Postman flow? I'm trying to wrap my head around the similarities between the two and would love your insights on it. So Arazzo specification versus the Postman flow. Maybe Frank on this one, if you're more familiar with it, or anybody else who's familiar with the Postman flow versus Arazzo.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, the Postman Flow's model is proprietary, so it's built within Postman. I think it's a derivative of Postman collections, but not the actual published open version thereof. I think from what we've been talking about in the broader community, and there's also been some folks from Postman who have been participating with us along the journey as well, is that we kind of see Arazzo as being that almost on steroids, and of course being vendor neutral and vendor agnostic, which will ultimately benefit all of us as API practitioners. So it will mean for any company who is looking to work with Arazzo into the future, they don't have to be worried about being locked into any specific vendor tooling. They will get more and more confidence as more and more tooling becomes available and becomes mainstream, that they can pick and choose what various tooling they want to use for various steps along the life cycle, and have the, I suppose, the confidence that Arazzo as a community standard or as an industry standard will bring that interoperability and that, let's say, that structure into their buying process as well, and that they will not be, they will not suffer from vendor lock-in.
Great point.
And
Eric, yep.
if I can just add to that, maybe, right? So I think Postman flows are like relatively close, right? There's the same kind of idea of describing, oftentimes also more kind of describing mostly the happy path, explaining how something works, how to combine endpoints and so forth. But as Frank said, it's not an open standard, and also because it's Postman, it's not really based on OpenAPI, right? It's based on collections mostly, because that is what Postman centers around. So you could think of it as something that is pretty close to what Arazzo does, but in the same way as Arazzo tries to be a really good player in the OpenAPI world, I would say Postman Flows just try to be a really good player, of course, in the Postman world, which is mostly focusing on the idea of collections and not so much OpenAPI.
Great, good point there. There are a couple of very, again, interesting questions coming in, and this is something I've pondered about myself a little while ago, which is Sunil in the audience asks, is there any plan to include non-REST APIs as well going forward, such as, say, GraphQL, for instance? We know that OAS traditionally has always been about sort of describing REST-based APIs. Is Arazzo going to be following a similar pattern? Is there opportunity for us to expand that in any way to other sort of API styles, or right now let's focus on REST only?
It almost made it in, but we, rather than waiting for everything to be perfect and get something out there, we decided to focus on being able to describe workflows across open API, documented APIs. But the next flavor that we will be introducing will be more event-driven APIs that are documented leveraging async API. So that's something that we will soon start working on from a working group perspective. And we're hoping that we'll be able to do so in a, let's say, non-breaking manner, so that we won't have to roll out a new major version of Arazzo. And we're quite confident that we'll be able to do so. So it's something to stay tuned on. I think it was very important for us to get a stable version 1 out the door. And we're kind of in the vendor support mechanism right now. So helping early adopters get support for version 1.0.0 implemented and out the door, which will then bring Arazzo to the practitioners. Because of course, us working on a specification as a working group is brilliant and getting it out there, but a specification in and of itself is not super interesting for maybe the vast majority of the API community. They need tooling support to also bring it to life and make it practically accessible. So that's our primary focus. But on the backlog, talking about the workflow in order of sequence, it's getting the JSON schema version published for V1, and then it's incorporating async API.
Great. I think that
GraphQL,
makes
no plans yet.
Sorry. That makes a good segue into perhaps the roadmap question. I think perhaps we touched upon that. in terms of, obviously, we are, like you say, we are trying to get this version 1.0 out there for more people to try it out. Let us look at some of the use cases out there, some that we have preempted, some which might be completely a surprise, perhaps. But all in all, would add to sort of the maturity of the specification as we go along. So just maybe speak a little bit about the roadmap that is already planned, perhaps, and any opportunities for people to put in their requests in terms of what the roadmap or how to shape the roadmap going forward.
Well, there's always opportunity for people to influence the roadmap. So anybody can come along and get involved with OpenAPI. You don't have to be an employee of a member organization. The project is fully under the Linux Foundation. We do have an open Slack workspace. We do have open GitHub repositories with active discussions, active issues. So if you're interested, and we'll share these links as well throughout today and in any follow-up material. But yeah, just get involved, join the Slack workspace. From an Arazzo perspective, we meet as a working group every 2 weeks. And that's also an open invite, so people can find the invitation for that on the OpenAPI calendar, which is available on the website and in the community repository within GitHub as well, as far as I'm aware. So anyone can come, they can suggest proposals, enhancements to the specification, use cases that they'd like to see covered, bugs, issues, all types of contributions are welcome, as long as you're adhering to our code of conduct, of course. So it's very open for anyone to try to influence. To kind of talk about concrete roadmap items that we're working on, as I said, we are getting good contributions from the community, helping us craft that initial JSON schema for Arazzo. And we're planning to start the proposals for how we will incorporate async API in. Outside of that, there's a few smaller roadmap items, but nothing groundbreaking. I think that there's sufficient problems in the API space to be addressed by Arazzo 1.0.0 as is, and then also incorporating an ability to have workflows that span request response type APIs as well as asynchronous APIs will broaden that web of problem spaces even further. But of course, if someone wants to think about how GraphQL could be incorporated, gRPC, etc., of course, more than welcome to review such proposals.
Great. Thanks, Frank.
I think I would
Lorna,
tag. I would tag on the end of that a really good way to get involved, and certainly the way that I came into the OpenAPI initiative originally, is by using the standards, trying it out in your own setting, and kind of giving that feedback as to what's working for you. I know that I'm here to represent Redockly, but actually my colleagues have been super active with the Arazzo specification. It really works well for us. We're enthusiastic about it. And that's part of the role that we play in the wider organization. And I would encourage everyone to look at what we have, look at the tooling support, think about how you would use it, try it, tell your friends, because that's actually a big part of supporting this type of work and seeing things getting developed and bringing those tools into your hands sooner.
And I think I've got a similar story as well, because I joined OpenAPI initiative myself because I work for a company called Tyke, and so Tyke is a cloud-native API management platform. And we started native support for the OpenAPI specification. And we immediately saw the value that it brought for all of our different users, as well as customers, and the way it sort of almost provided a shift in mindset, I felt, where the approach was a little bit different in terms of a design-first kind of a thinking, but not just the design, not just stopping there, but also being able to apply that and have tools that actually support them throughout that journey a little bit better. So I think that's what got me interested. But also, I think that the problem or the challenge that I was still facing was, in some cases, I was still looking for educational material. For instance, how do we get people to understand the true value of the OpenAPI specification? What are some of the stories that are already out there if people are just about getting started or they need to sell it to their bosses as a technology or a tool, what would that sort of journey look like? And I think that's where it all started. And here we are at the Open API initiative here. So that's been sort of my journey into the OAI, and perhaps you'll have a similar journey as well. I don't know, Eric, if you have any part to add here as well, because you've had an interesting journey into the Open API initiative yourself, and you've been very deeply involved as an ambassador as well as now a board member. So tell us about your experience.
Well, I think I would mostly like to add on to what Lorna said in the sense that the feedback I got for the last year when we had these sessions where Frank mostly talked about these things, or I just mentioned them somewhere, like there were always a whole bunch of people coming up and say, oh, I want to do this and this and this. And sometimes, they had different ideas of what they could do. But like Lorna suggested, just think about what you are doing that actually takes APIs and in some shape or form combines them, right? And how are you doing that? And are you happy with how you're doing that? And maybe also look at how could something like Arazzo fit into there. So a very typical example would be documentation, right? Like very likely pretty much anybody who creates APIs is documenting some path through them and say, well, if you want to get this done, here's the flow of things you need to do. So how are you doing that right now? And if that's something that feels a little awkward or feels like you're painting something and then it gets out of sync with how things really work, then maybe that's a good opportunity to think about how could that work better if I had tooling that was a little bit more descriptive, that helped me a little bit better to keep these things updated. So I think just trying to connect what we talked about today to what you're doing in your daily work, and then just explore briefly how Arazzo maybe could help you, and then also feed that back to the community and say, oh, that's all nice and well, but it also needs to do that, or we have a big gap, right? These are the kinds of things that also will help a lot with evolving the specification. So the sooner I think people start thinking about how it can help them, I think the sooner we get the feedback that helps us to make the specification better.
Absolutely, great points. There are a couple of more questions that have come through, so I'm going to pick those up as we are getting towards the close of our session. We have one question that talks about, is there a way today to visualize or build the Arazzo specification? I'm thinking of a canvas UI that can consume the Arazzo spec and show users the steps visually and allow editing further to their needs. So does something like this exist? Or maybe if not, then it's worth considering for the future, perhaps.
Officially, no. Unofficially, keep asking me. I can't give you early access yet, but I've seen a demo.
Okay.
I hope we'll have a lot of tools in this space that will let you. I mean, look, my boss published our roadmap on our blog yesterday, so I am not spoilering anything. But I think as a general comment about the tools, OpenAPI can be quite detailed in terms of describing the requests and responses, and Arazzo lets us kind of take that to a higher level and see how the pieces go together. So yeah, I do expect to see the visualization tools and kind of the step through tools. And also the opposite, where you can kind of put something together and turn it into a Arazzo specification. It's pretty human friendly, but maybe not everybody enjoys 50,000 lines of YAML as much as I do. And that's fair. So I think we'll see a lot of those tools, and talking a little bit about, like right now we have a bit of linting and some testing tools. Like, it's just the beginning. We're still seeing new tools in the OpenAPI specification arena. That's not new. And I expect the same thing to happen here.
Precisely. This is a hugely exciting space as well, which is why we wanted this to be sort of a, kickstart almost, to kickstart that conversation, that journey. And we're hoping to keep the conversations going as we go along too. So that'll be, that's kind of why we want your inputs and feedback as we go along. What do you actually need? Was it clear enough in terms of what Arazzo is providing right now? Do you need more educational support? Do you need more tooling support? What is it that would help you adopt something like this or consider adopting something like this? So do let us know. Moving on to perhaps the final
just
question.
Before you leave that point,
sorry,
but I have seen previews and I have had conversations with vendors about some of this stuff, and I'm really excited about some of the tooling that is being built that will start popping up throughout 2024. Like, there are things that are tantalizingly close. And one of the nice things about Arazzo, at least in all of the conversations that Eric alluded to, where we've talked about Arazzo at different conferences, all of the different personas that are involved across the API lifecycle see applicability for Arazzo. And that in turn will spawn the creation of tools that are specific for their needs. And so we won't be trying to fit necessarily a square peg into a round hole. There will be bespoke tooling that will be catering for the needs of specific personas. And I think that's one of the most exciting aspects of it.
Wonderful. All right. There is one other question. I think this will probably be the last one for today. Igor asks, unlike humans, AI-based algorithms will consume API other ways. Example, by creating or changing many business objects at once. Does the new specification consider this shift in any way? Our favorite AI-based topic comes in again.
It wouldn't be any webinar in 2024 if we hadn't AI in it, I would say. So yeah, I mean, there's so many different scenarios that you can look at when you consider AI. So I think what Igor is asking is a little bit more the kind of data collection aspect, that you would have AI kind of being steered to maybe harvest some data or access services to get data in like more of a bulk kind of way. That's something that may be something that people want to do. In that case, maybe you would even have specific Arazzo workflows for this kind of scenario that would tell you what to do. Maybe there is a bulk aspect that you can actually, where you can get more data or kind of get a bigger chunk of data or these kind of things. The thing that I actually find almost more interesting is a very different scenario where the question is just like, how do I teach an AI to do what I wanted to do? I think this is what Frank was alluding to, saying that, how do I tell my ChatGPT thingy how to actually buy a ticket, right? And do that without doing things that I really do not want to happen. And in that case, it really would be kind of the exact kind of workflow of the steps that I expect to happen. And it would be the same workflow that I would do as a human, just there would be a machine understandable description of it that I could hand over to some machine that then could just use that to walk through that without ever getting kind of lost along the way. So to me, that is the more exciting scenario, actually. But I would say that there are a whole bunch of different scenarios. If you just want to talk about Arazzo and AI, so to speak, a whole bunch of scenarios that you could discuss.
I think something that's gotten me interested as well is around how the workflow specification sort of feeds into the whole automation narrative. I think that's something that's quite big in the way you're dealing with APIs and data, and like it feeds into a whole range of different territories. And to be able to automate a lot of those processes based on a specification that is detailed enough to cover the majority of the test cases or the use cases associated with it, I think would make a huge difference. So that again speaks to, if you talk about value, that speaks to productivity. That if you talk about value, then it speaks to cost savings. It could even have other revenue generation capabilities built in by virtue of that automation process. So when I I think that's what again attracted me to Arazzo when I first read through the specification and what it was trying to achieve. To me, because automation has again been a bit of a hit and miss, if I'm being very honest. I think infrastructure wise, we seem to be doing kind of okay in the API space from the automation standpoint, but actual workflows around the APIs themselves, the way they are designed, the way they are handled and managed, I think Arazzo would go a long way in the way that would be achieved, I think. I don't know what you guys think about that sort of thinking, because I think that's what's gotten me excited about Arazzo.
Got it.
Yeah,
So,
no,
yeah, I think that really is like an interesting aspect, but that's probably a whole another hangout we could do, right? So that, I mean, that's a huge space, the whole low code, no code space, right? Basically tools that have evolved, which are not around a specification. It's just kind of specific tools, right? But I mean, as we've seen with that whole low code, no code space, there's a lot of value in that. There is a lot of stuff that you can do when it comes to providing services that allow people to combine different things, either because there are no APIs or maybe because you just need to have that automation aspect. And I think Arazzo might even invigorate that space actually a fair bit, because if those tools then can ingest Arazzo, they can actually do a much better job. And that also means that the description you need to describe then are not specific to one of those tools, but you could say, well, if I have an Arazzo description, it should be really work with all of these low code, no code tools, right? And if it doesn't, maybe at some point those tools actually need to up their game.
Absolutely fair point. All right. I think we're almost at time right now. So I don't know if there are any parting thoughts or a call to action, perhaps, for people who are listening to us right now. I've already shared the link to our Slack channel. So if you are interested, feel free to join us there and start a discussion, join one of the special interest groups, or join the outreach group, perhaps, or the Arazzo channel. There are a whole bunch of things that you can get involved in many different ways. There are obviously meetings that happen as well across the entire week, so you can be present for some of those. You don't always need to participate, but it'll be good for you to participate. So there are multiple ways in which, if this is something is of interest to you, then feel free to connect with us across. If LinkedIn is easy, feel free to do that on LinkedIn. If Slack is easier, feel free to do that on Slack. Or if there are other means that you would want to connect with us, feel free to do that as well. We're hoping to host these sessions again on a monthly basis. Currently, we are thinking about the sort of education and adoption aspect of things. We recently launched an OpenAPI fundamentals course, which some of you have already completed phenomenally enough. So we want more people to be aware of something like that, and hopefully even build on the educational courses that we already have got going. So we would love your feedback further in terms of what you would like to see in the future for these Hangouts, and tell us what you thought about this particular session. With that, any particular sort of closing remarks there, Frank, Lorna, Eric, before we say bye for this particular Hangout?
I'd just like to thank everybody for joining. As you alluded to, but all feedback is welcome. Feedback is something that we're always trying to get more of. So I think feedback on the Hangout session, feedback on Arazzo, feedback on OpenAPI. If you hit any roadblocks or dead ends, please let us know, and we will do our best to unblock you and get you engaged with the community. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Stay in touch. There's a lot going on right now across the OpenAPI initiative at all the different corners of, we've mentioned, the special interest groups. So just, stay in touch with us and let us know how it looks from where you're standing, because I think that helps us serve you better. So thanks.
Yep, same here. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Buddha, for managing and leading us through this Hangout. I'm really looking forward to the next one. And for everybody who watched, just if you watched this and thought that's all nice and well, but right, that is the part that we really want to hear. So if you have any thoughts like this, please let us know.
Wonderful. Thank you. So on that note, thank you so much, folks. It has been a pleasure hosting you today. Hopefully we'll see each other again at another Hangout, as well as on Slack, as well as on the meetings. There are multiple ways we are connected. So appreciate everyone who joined us live today, as well as those who will be watching us later on. And until next time, take care. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Bye.